So you want to own a parking garage, not a space, not a monthly permit. The whole structure. 6 floors of concrete, a ramp, a gate arm, and a little booth nobody sits in anymore. On the surface, it might be the simplest asset in a city. No tenant to chase. No fit out. No leasing agent. No kitchen to replace. No roof over most of it. No interior to redecorate. Cars drive in. Cars drive out. You keep the difference. That's the dream. Now here's what the brochure leaves out. You do not control one single thing that brings a car to your door. Not the office tower next door. Not the arena schedule. Not the train line. And definitely not the zoning code, which is the only reason half the parking in your city exists at all, and which is being repealed right now, city by city. So what does one space actually cost to build? Who pays you, and on which days? Why is your biggest expense not the concrete? And why did the man who built the largest parking company on earth spend 40 years avoiding owning parking? 3 ways in. They look similar from the street, and they are completely different businesses. Way 1. You build it. Everything in this industry gets priced per space, because that is the only unit that compares across cities. So here is the number. WGI, the engineering firm that has published an annual parking structure cost survey since 2006, put the national median construction cost for a new United States parking structure at $29,900 per space. Per space. Before you buy an inch of land. So, a 500-space garage, the kind bolted to a mid-sized downtown office block, is roughly a $15 million structure sitting on dirt you also have to pay for. And that median has been climbing hard. It broke $20,000 per space for the first time in 2018. Between 2020 and 2021 alone, it jumped from $22,200 to $25,700, a rise of nearly 16% in a single year. Go underground, and it gets worse fast. Excavation, shoring, waterproofing, ventilation, pumps, and a structural slab strong enough to hold a building on top of it. Now the other end. Surface lot. Grading, drainage, asphalt, striping, lights, a gate. A few $1,000s a space. Which raises the obvious question. If a flat lot costs a fraction of the cost of a structure, why does anybody build the structure? Hold that. It is the whole video. Way 2. You buy one that already exists. Garages trade like commercial real estate, priced off net operating income and a cap rate, with one difference that matters enormously. On an office building, the building is the asset. On a garage, the building might be the least valuable thing on the site. Way 3. And this is the one almost nobody outside the industry understands. You do not own any of it. You run somebody else's. There are 2 contract shapes here, and the difference between them is the difference between a job and a bet. Under a management agreement, the owner keeps the revenue and keeps the risk. You run the site and take a fee. Under a lease, you pay the owner fixed rent, and everything above that rent is yours. So is everything below it. Almost every big name in parking is in the first business. They operate. They do not own. So before you go further, get clear on which of 3 things you are actually buying. The concrete, the land under the concrete, or the contract to run somebody else's concrete. Those are 3 different companies. People lose money by thinking they bought one and actually buying another. Buy the structure, and 5 things come with it. First, and this is the strangest one, you inherit a rule. Most parking in America was not built because somebody wanted parking. It was built because a zoning code demanded it. Minimum parking requirements, written into city codes from the 1950s onward, told every developer exactly how many spaces they had to provide. Look at what happened to one of those codes over time. In Columbus, Ohio, in 1954, an apartment building with 101 bedroom units had to provide at least 100 parking spaces. By 2022, that same building had to provide 150. A 2,500 square foot restaurant went from 9 required spaces to 34. Nobody studied whether those cars existed. That number went up because numbers and codes go up. That is your inheritance. Your competition was not built by competitors. It was built by compliance. Second, the concrete itself, which is the most brutally exposed structure in any city. No walls, no climate control, no heating. Rain runs straight onto the deck. Cars drag road salt in on their tires in winter. Salt water reaches the steel reinforcement inside the slab. The steel rusts, rusting steel expands, and the concrete above it cracks and breaks away. That is called spalling. And every garage gets it. Restoration is not a repair, it is a program, and it arrives in one enormous bill decades after somebody else built the thing. Third, your monthly parkers who are contract customers, and most of those contracts can be canceled with about a month's notice. Your most stable revenue line is technically your least committed one. Fourth, the operator agreement, whichever of those two shapes it takes. And fifth, the one that actually decides your outcome, what you are allowed to build on that site instead. Height limits, floor area ratio, setbacks, use permissions. Because the day somebody offers you real money for that block, none of it depends on the garage. All of it depends on what the code lets the next owner put there. 5 ways this thing pays you, and they do not behave alike at all. Number 1. Transient parking. Hourly and daily drivers who show up, park, and leave. Highest rate per hour, and by far the most volatile line in the business. It moves with office attendance, weather, and whatever is happening downtown that day. Number 2. Monthly contract parkers. The base load, lower effective rate per space, far more predictable, and this is what pays your fixed costs while you wait for the transient business to show up. Number 3. Event parking. If you are near a stadium, an arena, a theater district, or a convention center, a single event night can price at several times the ordinary daily rate. Nobody negotiates at 7 in the evening when the doors open at 1:30. Number 4. Everything bolted to the structure that has nothing to do with cars. A ground floor retail bay facing the street, which rents as retail, not as parking. Signage and billboard rights on a blank concrete wall facing traffic. Antenna space on the roof, because a flat rooftop above surrounding buildings is exactly what a carrier wants. Electric vehicle charging, car washing, and detailing. Storage. And number 5, the exit. That is not really a revenue layer. It is the reason most of the serious money in this business exists, and we will come back to it. Now here is the number that reframes all 5. In 2026, researchers at UCLA published a study of what it actually costs to build parking, gathering construction costs across 17 United States cities. Their finding, not counting the land, an above-ground parking space cost an average of $52,000 to build. Underground, $73,000. Now, hold that next to one other figure. The average price of a new car in the United States is somewhere around $50,000. Listen to that again. The box you park the car in costs more than the car. And it gets stranger. Estimates put the total number of parking spaces in the United States at around 2 billion. For a country with roughly 300 million registered vehicles. In many American city centers, parking takes up more than a third of the land. So the picture is this. Country that built billions of concrete boxes, each costing more than the vehicle it holds, because a code written in the 1950s said it had to, and then gave most of them away for free. Which tells you the single most important thing about this business. Your real competitor is not the garage across the street. It is the enormous supply of free parking that somebody else was forced to build and has no idea what it cost them. You are not selling parking. You are selling the small number of spaces in your city that somebody is actually willing to charge for. So what does it cost to run one? Start with the biggest line. And most people guess wrong. It is not staff. It is not the concrete. It is property tax. A garage in a strong downtown sits on some of the most valuable land in the city, and it gets assessed accordingly. You are taxed on the value of a site that could hold a tower, while earning the income of a place that holds cars. Then, labor, though this is the line that has changed most. cashiers, attendants, valet staff, security. Automated gates, license plate cameras, and phone payment have taken a lot of that out, which is exactly why technology companies started buying parking companies. Then insurance, which is a serious number, because you are inviting the public to drive 2-ton vehicles up a spiral ramp in the rain. Then, card fees. When your average transaction is a few dollars, payment processing is not a rounding error. It is a real percentage of revenue. Then, the running costs. Lighting on every level, all day, because there are no windows deep in a garage. Elevators. Sweeping. Snow and ice clearing on the top deck. Line repainting. Security patrols. Drainage. And then, the one that ruins people. Restoration. Concrete repair. Deck waterproofing. Joint replacement. And on some structures, replacing the tension steel cables running through the slabs. This arrives as a single enormous project, not a monthly cost. And if the previous owner deferred it, you did not buy a garage. You bought a bill. Now notice the shape of this ledger, because it explains everything in the next section. Almost every line on it is fixed. Property tax does not fall when the office tower next door empties out. Insurance does not fall. Lighting does not fall. Restoration does not fall. Revenue moves. Costs do not. In a good year, that gap is why this asset prints. In a bad year, it is why it stocks. Here it is. And it has 2 jaws. Jaw 1. You own the box. Somebody else owns the reason anybody comes. The office tower across the street signs a lease, and your monthly parkers arrive. That tower loses its anchor tenant, or its staff stop coming in 5 days a week, and your monthly parkers vanish. You cannot renovate your way out of it. You cannot market your way out of it. A garage next to an empty building is an empty garage. Jaw 2, and this is the newer one. The rule that built your competition is being deleted. Buffalo, New York, became the first major American city to abolish parking minimums entirely in 2017, tearing up a zoning code written in 1953. Since then, it has become a wave. According to the Parking Reform Network, more than 116 cities have now removed all parking minimums citywide. Since 2019, at least 14 states have passed 34 separate laws, reducing or eliminating them. Now think carefully about which direction that cuts, because it is not obvious. In the long run, less mandated parking means less free parking, and scarcity is good for anybody charging for it. But in the short run, it means something else. Every developer who was previously forced to buy your problem is now free to build without it. The subsidized competition stops growing, and so does the automatic demand that came from cities designed around driving. You are holding a fixed cost structure on taxed land, exposed to a demand curve set by other people's buildings, in a market where the rule that created the whole business is being unwound. Which is why the smart money in parking stopped thinking of it as a parking business decades ago. In the early 1950s, a man named Monroe Carell Sr. was working an office job for a railway in Nashville, Tennessee. On the side, he leased a piece of downtown land and ran it as a surface parking lot. He teamed up with a colleague from the railway and leased more surplus railroad property in Nashville, in Atlanta, in St. Louis. They called it central parking. In the late 1960s, he talked his son into leaving his job. Monroe Carell Jr. had an electrical engineering degree from Vanderbilt, and he walked away from engineering to run a handful of parking lots. Now watch what he did, because it is the opposite of what you would expect. He did not go out and buy garages. He went out and won management contracts. Cities were rebuilding their downtowns through the 1970s and 80s. Every new tower needed parking, and almost all of that parking was owned by somebody whose actual business was offices, or hotels, or hospitals, and who had no interest in running a parking operation. Carell sold them the operation. He recruited college-educated managers into an industry that was almost entirely family-run, and he built a professional operating company on top of other people's concrete. From roughly 10 lots, central parking grew to more than 4,000 facilities across the United States, Europe, South America, and Asia, parking an average of 2 million cars a day. It listed on the New York Stock Exchange in 1995. By 1997, Carell was on the Forbes 400 with an estimated fortune of $600 million. When the company was sold to private equity in May 2007, the deal was worth around $725 million to shareholders. And the Carell family, holding close to half the stock, walked away with roughly $350 million. He built the largest parking company in the world. He did it by almost never buying the parking. Which brings us to the most expensive parking decision in American history. And it was not made by an investor. It was made by a city. December 2008. Chicago is deep in the financial crisis and needs cash without raising taxes. Mayor Richard M. Daley had already privatized the Chicago Skyway 3 years earlier, so the playbook existed. On the 2nd of December, his team unveiled a proposal to lease the city's entire metered parking system. 36,000 meters. 75 years. On the 4th of December, 2 days later, the city council approved it by 40 votes to 5, after a few days with an agreement running more than 500 pages. Buying it was Chicago Parking Meters, a consortium led by Morgan Stanley. Price: $1,157 million. Paid up front. The lease runs to 2083. Now the numbers that came out afterwards. Before the deal, in 2007, that meter system produced about $22.9 million of operating revenue and roughly $18.9 million of net income for the city. On the 2nd of June, 2009, 6 months after the vote, City Inspector General David Hoffman published his analysis. His conclusion was that the city had been paid, conservatively, about $974 million less than the system was worth to it over 75 years, a discount of roughly 46%. His report also found that the city's chief financial officer had never calculated what the system would be worth if the city just kept it. The council voted without that comparison in front of them. And then the meters got expensive. Hourly rates in the central area went from around $3 in 2008 to $6.50 by 2013 and around $7 by 2023. Now the part that makes this the definitive case. Audits by KPMG show the system generated about $1.97 billion for the concession company through 2024, including a record year of about $160.9 million in 2023. It took roughly 10 years for the investors to earn back their entire purchase price. There were 58 years left on the lease, and it keeps costing. Because the contract requires the city to compensate the company whenever meters are taken out of service, for street festivals, for construction, for a bike lane, Chicago has paid tens of millions of dollars buying back its own curb. One tally put those payments at about $78.8 million over 12 years. Meanwhile, the city spent almost the entire windfall inside 2 years, plugging budget holes. So, read the whole thing back. A city sold 75 years of a permanent revenue stream at roughly half its value to cover about 2 years of deficits, and now pays a private company for permission to redesign its own streets. Parking was never the point. The contract was 5 habits, and every one comes out of what you just watched. Habit 1. Underwrite the land, not the parking. The parking income tells you what the asset yields today. Land tells you what the asset is. If the dirt is not appreciating, you are running a low-margin business on expensive taxed ground, and there is no ending to that story. Habit 2. Keep your exit unblocked. Long monthly contracts feel like stability. They are also a rope tied to your ankle when a developer knocks. Keep terms short and keep the site clean of anything that makes a future sale complicated. Habit 3. Own the parts that are not parking. The retail bay, the signage rights, the rooftop antenna lease, the charging. Those are real estate income lines attached to a parking asset, and they hold up when the driving does not. Habit 4. Pick your contract shape honestly. Take a management agreement when you are not confident in the demand, and take a lease when you are and want the upside. Getting that backwards is how operators go under while the owner does fine. Habit 5. Fund the concrete from year 1. Restoration is not a risk. It is a certainty on a schedule you did not set. Owners who reserve for it, survive it. Owners who defer it, hand it to the next buyer as a discount, which comes out of exactly one pocket. Theirs. Both years, honestly. Start with the good year. Downtown is busy. Monthlies are full, and rates step up with inflation. Transient traffic is strong midweek, and events fill your evenings. Your costs are fixed, so almost all of that extra revenue lands at the bottom. And underneath it, the land quietly appreciates while somebody else pays you to store their car on it. That is a very good business. Now the bad year. That tower next door loses its tenant. Monthlies do not renew. Transient traffic thins. And every fixed line stays exactly where it was, because property tax, insurance, and lighting have never once cared about your occupancy. A 20% fall in revenue does not cut your profit by 20%. It can remove it. And then the restoration bill lands. Now, the honest scoreboard, and it is the most revealing number in this whole video. In October 2023, a technology company called Metropolis agreed to buy SP Plus, the largest parking network in North America, for $54 a share in cash. That was a 52% premium to where the stock had closed days earlier, and an enterprise value of roughly $1.5 billion. The deal closed in May 2024, backed by $1.8 billion of financing. What did $1.5 billion buy? More than 4,000 locations, around 20,000 employees, and a payments flow of over $4 billion a year. What it did not buy was the garages. SP Plus is an operator. Concrete belongs to the owners it works for. So, the biggest check written in modern parking was written for the contracts, the network, and the technology, not for a single slab of concrete. So, does it work? Yes, and beautifully. If you own the land, treat parking as the interim use and take the ancillary income seriously. And no, it does not work if you bought a garage believing that parking was the business. Every winner in this story owns something other than the parking. Carell built the largest parking company on earth and spent his career running other people's garages, not buying them. Morgan Stanley's consortium did not buy a single space in Chicago. They bought a clause for 75 years and had their money back in 10. Metropolis paid $1.5 billion for 4,000 locations and took ownership of almost none of them. And the city that owned all of it, the meters, the curbs, the streets, the actual asset, is the only party in this story that lost. Because a parking garage is not a business you run. It is a building that pays the taxes on land, while the land decides what it wants to be. Nobody ever got rich on the parking. They got rich on the block underneath it, and the garage was just what the block did for a living while it waited.